Welcome to History 111, Lecture 2, Motives for European Exploration. When we start to think about why Europeans wanted to explore at this point, we have to begin by thinking about what's going on towards the end of the medieval period. And this is a point where they're trying to reestablish trade with distant locations, and a lot of countries see it as a way to become rich. Now, European trade with Asia had been reestablished by the 13th century, but the decline of the Mongols and Byzantine empires in the late 14th and 15th centuries mean that trade with Asia is going to come to a halt again. And that's going to also result in the placement of hostile countries between European nations and the Chinese empire that they're seeking to trade with. Now, Spain and Portugal both believe that renewed trade with China will make them wealthy and powerful, and they start to look for alternative routes to China. And this is going to force them to look for a western route, as the eastern land route is going to require travel through hostile countries. The only other alternative is to try to go south around Africa and see if there's a naval route there. So at this point, we do have to realize that no one thought the world was flat. This is an idea made popular by a man named Washington Irving, who published an 1828 biography of Columbus, but it had really no basis in fact. Washington Irving was one of those sorts of people who wanted to publish a good book. He was a well-known literary figure, and he wasn't going to let facts get in the way of a good story. So when he tells a story, he puts a bit of conflict in there, but that simply has no basis in history. Now, what no one knew at this point was how big the sphere was. They knew the world was round. That was common knowledge among educated people since late antiquity. The only problem is nobody knew how big it was. So, Europeans also at this point knew there was land to the west. A colony had been established in Greenland, which is part of North America, at the end of the 10th century, although that colony was being abandoned towards the beginning of the 15th century. Now, explorers in this colony are also believed to have reached bases on the North American mainland, possibly as far south as Massachusetts. So Europeans, although not all Europeans, knew there were things out there. It was just a question of could they get to them. Now, Portugal enters into this very early because Portugal is reconquered from the Moors before Spain is. Now, Prince Henry the Navigator is going to fund voyages of exploration in 1415. Now, as a result of their voyages, the Portuguese are going to develop better ship designs that are capable of longer voyages. And because of the technological limits of the day, the Portuguese don't look at going west as a viable proposition. They instead choose to go south, exploring the coast of Africa and establishing trade posts throughout West African countries, and that's going to bring them considerable wealth through trade with those people. The Portuguese are also going to discover some Atlantic islands and establish plantations that are going to be worked by slaves that are acquired through trade with Africa, but they're not going to engage in a lot of westward exploration. They're going to go explore the coast of Africa. Although the Portuguese have been looking for a route to Asia since about 1415, they really accelerate for a variety of factors in the 1480s, and they really begin to actively start to look for that route to Asia. And again, the Portuguese knew if you sailed west, you would get there, but they didn't believe you could actually make that attempt because of the distance and the limits of their technology. So they really started pushing this whole idea of sailing around Africa. The only problem is they did not know how big Africa was, and it was only in 1488 they finally found the southern tip of Africa. And it's another 10 years later before Vasco da Gama actually reaches India. So they keep building and exploring and building on what they've already done, and they really push the drive towards getting around Africa. Now, as the Portuguese are engaging in all this exploration, they're beginning to realize how big Africa is, and realizing that these are going to be very long voyages to trade with Asia by this way. Now, enter into this a man named Christopher Columbus, who first comes to the Portuguese and tries to convince them to sponsor a voyage to find what he calls the fast route to India. And he pitches this idea using maps that contain two major flaws. First, they had massively underestimated the size of the Earth, and they had also greatly overestimated the size of Europe relative to everything else. Now, based on his flawed information, he concluded that he can make landfall in Asia after about 2,500 miles and then sail 1,500 miles to India with little difficulty. And this was significantly less than the distance that Diaz had sailed to reach the southern tip of Africa, so it sounded really, really good. Now, that said, the Portuguese didn't buy it, because most people at this point thought the Earth was bigger than Columbus said, and his ideas really didn't go over very well. And what they believed is if they funded this voyage, he would have to either turn back or die at sea. And what it really comes down to is they were half right. Columbus was off by about 9,000 miles, but what no one knew was what the Americas were within range of his ships, and that where he thought Asia would in fact be a different and so far to Europeans unknown continent. Now, while the Portuguese don't buy into what Columbus is selling, the Spanish certainly do. And Spain had just finished the reconquest. It took them a lot longer, and they really wanted to get in on this trade game, and they saw that West Africa was really already dominated by the Portuguese, so they decided why not, and they took the risk. Now, the fact that Columbus was successful in finding land led to a lot of effects. Portugal begins to see Spain as a challenge to its trade empire, and they eventually end up having to draw a line on the map to establish what is going to be Spain's to claim and what is going to be Portuguese. So they drew a line, and Spain gets everything to the west, and Portuguese gets everything to the east. And this sparks a big interest in exploration cartography and to find out what's out there, and in particular, find out what lands and riches were there and which side of this east or west line they were on. Because while they knew the Earth was a sphere, they didn't know its size and they didn't know where to draw the line on the other side. So there's a lot of voyages that go on trying to decide what's going to be Spanish and what's going to be Portuguese. Here we have, just to give you a sense of what Europeans knew at this time, a 1507 map of the world. And it's very early, and again, remember, Columbus's voyage is 1492, so this is only 15 years later. And what you can see is you can see Africa very clearly. You can see Europe in a very recognizable form. You see some kind of islands and some things out in where the Americas belong, and you can kind of see how Asia wraps around. And what we can note here is that this is before Europeans have worked out all the math to figure out how to show a map the way that we're used to. And so they kind of are starting to draw what they know, fill in the gaps, and so on and so forth. The more they do this, the more they realize what they don't know, and it sparks more and more interest in exploration. So, what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, Europeans are exploring because they want to find other alternative ways to trade with Asia. And while they're at it, they want to find other places to trade. So, what's really motivating European exploration? Money. See you in the next lecture.